and those persons who are close to him. This was unsuccessful, luckily. However, these people are directly managed by Prigozhin. There is a peculiar situation to do with the legal status of the structures of Mr. Prigozhin. According to the Russian law, this private military company is a criminal offense. An attempt to legalize or to introduce into the law the activity of such companies was attempted. However, in Russia, Mr. Prigozhin acted against this initiative because the current legal status, first of all, allows him not to be regulated by the Ministry of Defense or any other state authority. And secondly, people who work for him are criminals according to the Russian law, and therefore they are in serious dependence on him. That's why this status, he is quite happy with this current status. And now the groups of Mr. Prigozhin, apart from taking part in military action in Ukraine, are also taking part in special operations in Africa.
Apologies. We've been very surprised. Well, first of all, I'd like to express our sadness at the loss of the 3 journalists, of your 3 friends who were murdered. And I'd also like to put on record our sympathies to all those whose loved ones have been murdered, raped or tortured by the Wagner Group across the world. Looking specifically at Ukraine, I think in the UK we've been very surprised by the domestic levels of support for what is taking place in Ukraine, or at least what appears to us in the UK to be high levels of domestic support for the invasion. But you recently said in The Guardian that many Russians don't want to fight, which we've also become aware of, and that domestic anger is growing. How do you think that discontent is going to manifest itself in the coming weeks and months, particularly as we go into the winter, where presumably there'll be less movement on the ground, but far more use of cruise missiles and terrorization of the public, particularly in Ukraine?
To my great sadness, propaganda, including the propaganda that is being delivered by Mr. Prigozhin, but not just by him, significantly influences Russian population. After the war of 2008, in this direction, the Kremlin has achieved very significant success. And I must tell you that being citizens of a democratic country, it is difficult for you to imagine how much propaganda that works in 3D, as so we can say, from all sides, how much it changes or alters consciousness of people. Nevertheless, according to social surveys, I don't know how much you can trust those, taking into account the war that's going on. 14% of Russian citizens said that they are against the war in Ukraine. For UK, this would be a very small number, but in conditions where people believe they are giving an answer to somebody who will inform FSB, where they are speaking in the context of authoritarian regime, means that this 14% of population have a very strong belief. And that means they are prepared for a sacrifice. About 10 to 15% of population are on the opposite side of the spectrum. They subscribe to the opposite point of view. In Russian political terminology, we call them national patriots, nationalist patriots. They are the closest to the ideology that was there in Nazi Germany. The rest of the population, about 70% of population, either do not have their own point of view or they're hiding their point of view. And they are hiding this point of view until that relates to them, the situation relates to them. The situation with mobilization increased the proportion of people who are concerned with what's going on in Ukraine from about 30% to over 60% over the course of 2 weeks. And Putin had to stop mobilization in many regions before the end of the official date. I believe that restarting mobilization would be a very difficult decision for Putin. And it would be a very politically dangerous decision for him.
Thank you. And before I turn to my colleague Royston, how do you expect in coming months for opposition to the illegal invasion to manifest itself, to show itself to us externally? Because there is a common narrative in the Western world that Putin has eviscerated all meaningful opposition to him. It's a police state. It's very difficult for people to rise up or show opposition. What sorts of markers should we be looking for that demonstrate unhappiness or challenge to his authority that we might not, as external observers, naturally identify?
The most obvious marker of discontent would be immigration. After the announcement of mobilization, about 700,000 people, taking the customs figures of the neighboring countries, left Russia. You need to understand that this is a serious blow for the Putin's defense industry and generally for the economy of Russia. It could be that this blow is a much more significant blow than any other sanction. At the same time, these people allow the countries that open the doors to them to gain significant economic benefit, because these are not just average Russian citizens. These people are the most active people, and they are the most educated people who have certain financial means. And in particular, I can give you an example that the departure of about 30,000 Russian programmers who are now mainly based in Cyprus and also in other countries, but mainly in Cyprus. This has significantly hit the ability of Kremlin to continue the cyber war. The similar situation is taking shape to do with engineers who are there to resolve the problems of reproduction of high-precision weapons. So this is the most precise criteria, but there are other criteria as well. In the Russian tradition, actions against power is expressed in sabotage, and this sabotage is seen today, can be witnessed today. People refuse to take their children to the mobilization points. They refuse to take part in producing weapons. They counteract the movements of trains with military equipment. Whether we will see mass demonstrations and mass protests in the streets, I'm not so sure of. And I need to point out that this tendency for open protests is a presumption that exists in democratic societies, because a protest which is not equipped with any weapons, it's a means of influencing elections. But if there are no elections, then this unarmed opposition means nothing. And then we saw this in Belarus, where a large proportion of Belarus citizens came out into streets, but they came out without any weapons, and that has led to nothing. The next stage of the opposition fight in Russia would happen if Putin loses the war, and this stage would be connected to either violence or, in any case, a threat of using force from the side of the protesters.
Chairman, my colleague Bob Seeley in the last session made reference to the abilities of the Russian military and their special forces, which made us think, I think, why would the Kremlin want to use proxy private militaries in places like Ukraine and elsewhere when they have the ability to do that themselves?
There are several reasons. The simplest, is to do with the fact that Putin psychologically has a tendency for special operations and for apparent external semblance to legality. And you can see this in his statements, public statements. He always lies. And you would think, why would he lie? Because he believes that if he is not saying something openly, and if it cannot be proven, then it somehow does not exist. From this point of view, it is very comfortable for him to have proxy units, and the largest amongst them is Wagner, but there are some others as well, where he can state that it wasn't me. And I'll give you an example. Well-known events in Syria where Wagner attempted to attack oil refinery, which was under the protection of American units. According to various estimates, around from several dozens to around 300 Wagner fighters were killed. We know that Americans did contact the Ministry of Defense using the channels of communication, and they did ask whether these were Russian units who were approaching the refinery. And twice they received a negative reply. And Putin still has not recognized the participation of these, in essence, Russian forces in this catastrophic operation. For this is for him, that's very comfortable. The second thing, and that is a much more unexpected point, as you were able to witness using the example of the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal here in the UK. Units of the GRU are not highly qualified. And unfortunately, I have to recognize the fact that the units that are formed by Mr. Prigozhin until very recently have been more effective. Today, because of the the main part of his personnel has been killed in action in Ukraine, he has to hire more people. And I'm sure that the general qualification of these people would be lower. But because he's got the experience of military operations in third countries, we could say that his people were more prepared, more highly prepared than people from the Ministry of Defense.
Well, I don't think any of us will probably argue that the Wagner Group is inextricably linked to the regime. But how then would how would you suggest that the military chain of command was linked to the Kremlin, and how would you evidence that?
Again, I have to refer to the particular features of dictatorial regimes. The main political currency in such regimes as Putin's regime is, as we say, access to the body. In other words, opportunity for one person or another to meet Mr. Putin personally. People who have direct access to the dictator in terms of their status, irrespective of their formal position, are higher than those who are not able to meet the dictator personally. That's why the influence of Mr. Prigozhin is approximately equal to the influence of Mr. Shoigu, Minister of Defense of Russia, or Mr. Lavrov, Foreign Minister of Russia. And the currency is the only currency. So the number of available meetings with the dictator. And for Mr. Prigozhin, he's got a lot of that currency, a lot of personal meetings with Putin. And in terms of the influence of Mr. Prigozhin, what can persuade you is what's published in the Russian, or what's been published by the Russian bloggers. Most likely that according to maybe Mr. Prigozhin's instructions, his recordings of his meetings in the prisons, in Russian prisons, with criminals that are serving their sentence. The possibility to recruit from prisons into his military units, irrespective of the gravity of crimes that they committed, that possibility to liberate these people means that Mr. Prigozhin has signed blank decrees of the presidents on pardon of these people. And this is a very high level of interaction with power. This is a very high level of influence. This has a criminal nature because what is being done is not in any way in accordance with the letter of the law and also with the spirit of the law. This is just not provided for in the Russian law. Nevertheless, he is doing it. He is doing it publicly, and nobody can put anything against it. So this is a legally acting gang that acts with violation of the Russian law. And the only boss of this gang is personally Mr. Putin, President Putin.
Thank you, Chair. That's quite a statement that you've just said, that the power of Wagner is on a par with the foreign minister or the defense minister within the Kremlin. Therefore, what, if anything, do you think would make the Kremlin stop using groups like Wagner?
I would like to clarify that naturally Wagner Group is not equal in terms of its power to the Ministry of Defense or to the Foreign Ministry. However, the personal influence of Mr. Prigozhin is equal to the personal influence of Mr. Shoigu or Mr. Lavrov. Such instrument as Wagner Group, Mr. Putin likes it very much, and that's seen through these all these possibilities or opportunities that Putin is opening to them. That's heavy military equipment and personnel, and the money that Mr. Prigozhin is receiving from the state budget, and he is using this money to finance these groups. These are large amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. And the criteria here is only one, as it looks to me. It's loyalty. Wagner Group is a very dangerous weapon, as dangerous as Kadyrov's group. However, loyalty here is only important in relation to Putin. Conflict of this group with the Ministry of Defense, with Mr. Shoigu, which we witness all the time, is not something that will force him to stop the activity of Wagner Group.
Following on, you mentioned earlier on the heavy influence of the state in terms of how the Russian public receive information, and yet despite that opposition, what is the opinion of the Russian public towards the Wagner Group? How much awareness is there of what the Wagner Group is doing and the level of its involvement in terms of Russian foreign and military policy, or Kremlin foreign and military policy?
Wagner Group was created around 2014, and it has become known around 2015. The first survey that is known to us in relation to Wagner was done in 2017. In 2017, the majority of Russian population, around 80%, did not support the existence of Wagner Group. However, public opinion has changed after the start of the conflict in Ukraine. Mr. Prigozhin expressed it through words that have become quite public. He said either them, he talked about his combatants, or your children. And this is what's in the mind of the people. Today, according to the surveys that are being conducted by different social survey companies, they're not that independent, but nevertheless, about 90% of population supports the existence of Wagner Group. So the situation has changed because people believe that the alternative to this would be the conscripts.
Bob, please.
Добрый день, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Спасибо за ваше время.
Thank you for your time.
On what you were saying, because I was going to ask you about how much power Prigozhin has in the Kremlin, but you've talked about that in some detail, comparing him with Lavrov and Shoigu. I just want to put a couple of arguments to you about the future of Prigozhin, but also about his power within the Kremlin, just to develop those themes. In many ways, Lavrov is less independent than Prigozhin and doesn't have the luxury of speaking out against the war. And Shoigu has become increasingly discredited because the Russian army has so badly underperformed and now becomes second to Wagner in material, etc. So I would have thought there's an argument that says that Prigozhin has potentially got more power than these other actors, provided he stays within the bounds of supporting the president. So he can attack the war effort as long as he doesn't attack Putin personally. I mean, do you think that his star is still rising and Lavrov and Shoigu are now declining?
We have to divide the possibilities of the structure and the influence of personalities. If we talk about the structure, what potential it has, Wagner is a relatively small group compared to the potential of the Ministry of Defense. It's not even a division. The supply, the artillery, and air support is done by the Ministry of Defense. So as a military unit, they are not significant. However, from the point of view of political influence, as is expressed in terms of influence on Mr. Putin, it's a different situation. And a lot of people are convinced that, and myself included, that appointment of Mr. Surovikin, who is the head of the all-military group conducting the war in Ukraine, and an appointment of one of his subordinates. This was lobbied by the group Prigozhin, Kadyrov, and Zolotov, either directly or through proxies. This is an important element, because if this is true, and if these people are loyal to this group, then this is a significant fighting power. They do not have significant potential in terms of internal politics while Putin is in power. However, if Putin loses the war, or if he loses his position in any other way, this group will be very significant. And the vector of its activity would be clear. They would be moving in the direction of continuing the war. Because these people, with a difference to everyone else, have political influence. They have their influence as far as the war is going on, because if the war stops, then their political influence ceases.
Do you think if President, you're talking about President Putin winning the war or losing the war, and if he loses the war and his role then becomes significantly under threat, is Prigozhin someone who is able to step in using muscle, if need be, to either build himself up as an independent player in Moscow, or indeed, should there be violence in Moscow, that his Wagner Group, as you say, small on the battlefield, but on the streets of Moscow, in situations of chaos in future, could become a decisive factor? Or is this, I mean, that's sort of going back to 1991 territory, but is that a realistic outcome, or is that still quite a long way away? I see that.
We, I'm talking about Russian opposition, believe that Wagner Group, of course it's a very nominal kind of name, they could play a significant role with any outcome of the war, because using this group as a force by Putin would be considered as an opportunity to not recognize his own participation in the situation. I think that this group will be used not just in Africa, but also in Europe. As far as Moscow is concerned, again, yes, indeed, this is one of the dangers to them, especially taking into account the marked interaction with Mr. Kadyrov, who is the head of Chechnya, who has his own military groups, which are formally part of National Guard, but in actual fact, they directly are commanded by Mr. Kadyrov, several thousand people, and also National Guard, Zolotov, who is also part of this group. And they've got about 300,000 men. And this is a significant force. Of course, they cannot be assembled at one place. However, they can be engaged. It's not obvious that there would be a monolith group, a coherent group. And there are two factors to do with this. First factor is that Wagner Group has increased in its size. It's increased in its size. And the opposite vector, Wagner Group today has lost a significant part of its professional men. So people who are fighting there are not loyal personally to Prigozhin and to other commanders, as it used to be, as the case used to be. So it's a precarious situation, but it's not a terrible situation.
What are the prospects, do you think, of holding Mr. Prigozhin himself responsible for his own activities in relation to the Wagner Group and what the Wagner Group has been doing either in Africa or in the Ukraine war?
If Mr. Putin has any doubts about the loyalty of Mr. Prigozhin, then persecuting him according to law would be very likely. There are several criminal laws which are directly violated by Wagner and Mr. Prigozhin. Their activity comes under the definition of of a criminal organization, criminal group, which are engaged in hiring mercenaries, which is a severe crime under Russian law, and they are engaged in terrorism and killing. And this can be proven quite easily, in my opinion. If there are no doubts in the loyalty of Mr. Prigozhin, Putin will not have, if he doesn't have any doubts, then such bringing him to responsibility would only be possible after the change of the regime.
Thank you. In the previous session, one of the individuals giving evidence suggested to us that if, and I think we all would like to say when, Putin loses his illegal war in Ukraine, he will seek to blame the Wagner Group and use them as a fall guy for why he was not successful in his ambitions in Ukraine. Do you think that's a likely activity? Because that would therefore call into question the deniability he uses. And what do you think that would look like?
Wagner Group can be blamed quite easily for committing separate murders or separate crimes in Ukraine. However, placing responsibility on them for the unsuccessful operation, I don't think it would be swallowed very easily, even by the Russian society. The fact that about 150 to 200,000 men were involved in the operation, and Wagner Group, around 7,000 men, doesn't sound serious. And there's a certain public consensus on this, that the person to blame is Mr. Shoigu. There is one reason why I would also place responsibility on Mr. Shoigu, and I've known him for 30 years. It's because he was one of the two people who put maximum influence on Mr. Putin on taking that decision to start the war. I don't know to what degree that influence was required. Maybe Putin had his own conviction. But the two people who influenced Putin most was Shoigu and Kovalchuk. I'd like to point out that this is the second case in Russian history, in the recent Russian history. Before that, it was Mr. Grachev who said to Mr. Yeltsin that he will take Grozny using one group in 3 days. And Shoigu stated that he would take Kiev in 3 days. So it's an exact exact copy of that situation.
Aware that we're running out of time, last question to you, if I may. In terms of the British government and international government's actions on Wagner Group, where have you felt that we have most let down the victims of the Wagner Group, and what should we be doing that we're not? And then secondly, is there anything that you wish we'd asked you, and any final points that you would like to make to the committee?
First of all, I think that what Wagner Group was doing in Africa, in essence, they were preparing and training of combat groups, the military reconnaissance and sabotage groups. It should have raised great concern and great response at that time. I don't know how much the government of UK, France, or United States at fault, but we were trying to raise this issue from 2018. I can't say we were very successful, but we managed to achieve a situation where Mr. Prigozhin was perceived as a danger in the United States, but not from the point of view of the actions of his military groups, but from the point of view of his propaganda people. In my opinion, this was a great underestimation of the enemy. Another nuance that I wanted to point out, I understand that today the greatest compassion should go to Ukrainians, and Ukrainians who are forced to leave Ukraine. However, in my opinion, we should not forget those Russians who, by refusing to participate in the mobilization, are leaving Russia. I would like to emphasize again, for two reasons at least, apart from general humanitarian concerns. First of all, this is a very significant blow against the ability of Mr. Putin to support a technological competency. Secondly, it's the opportunity for a number of countries, including the UK, to use the desire of these people and the ability of these people to create new technologies, new businesses, and give them this opportunity. And give them this opportunity to do this in freedom. I would like to remind you that the creation of the Soviet nuclear bomb, the creation of the Soviet nuclear bomb was done by Mr. Kurchatov and others when they were working effectively in prison conditions. And I would like to say, let's not repeat this mistake. UK has got Global Talent Program, a wonderful program, and I think we should do maximum to use this program to extract maximum benefit in using the situation in Russia.
More than just to say thank you for your considered contribution today and for taking the time to share your thoughts with us, which were very much welcome. I know you've previously given evidence to the committee, so thank you for coming before us again. And with that, we will suspend the sitting and finish the sitting for the day. Order. Spasibo.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.